Good morning, Professor.
Good morning. Thank you for coming.
It's a pleasure. I'm Jay Nishant. I'll be moderating your presentation, and maybe I will also facilitate the question and answers followed by your presentation.
Good. Thank you very much.
It will be a privilege and pleasure. May I ask you a couple of things to begin with first? I mean, the event is not started, I know for sure. Especially help me pronounce your publications. How do you pronounce it? Is it PostImperial Elites?
PostImperial Imperii. But you could just say that, you could just cite the English language version, Imperial Ends.
Okay, but I just wanted to know how exactly this word is pronounced.
PostImperial Imperii.
Okay, is that, which language is that? Russian?
That's in Ukrainian.
Ukrainian.
And there's also a Russian translation called Puty Imperii, which is, again, a slightly different translation. But I think the English language.
Okay, so imperial ends, the decay, collapse, and revival of empires.
Yes.
So that's the name, and the other two, one in Russian,
Translation.
one in Ukrainian. Is it so?
Yes, exactly, sir.
Oh, then I think I can skip the very difficult long questions.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was struggling to make a sense out of this.
No, it can be very complicated, I know.
Hello. Yes, now we gonna start today's webinar. Professor Alexander J. Motyl and dear participant, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our very special webinar on the Russo-Ukrainian war, causes and consequences. Before we start, let me briefly introduce NICE. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflict are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. To moderate our very interesting topic for today, we have very distinguished scholar Jay Nishant. Jay Nishant is president of Nepal Democracy Foundation. Earlier, he has worked with National Democratic Institute and Millennium Challenge Corporation. He has designed and implemented various democracy and legislative programs with a special focus on political party strengthening, parliamentary support, civil society development, supporting free and fair election. Mr. Nishant is a Stanford Fellow on democracy, development, and rule of law, and a noted media personality. He regularly contributes to Nepal's leading newspaper on current affairs, politics, international relations, and development issues. Jay Nishant, over to you.
Thank you, Saroji, for that very kind and generous introduction. Good evening, everyone. It's the evening time in Nepal, and if you are somewhere else in a different time zone, then let me say good morning or maybe good afternoon, whatever suits you. But we all feel very happy and privileged over here to find you joining this extremely important session, which is going to be in a while by Professor Alexander J. Motyl. And let me tell you, the issue we'll be discussing today is as important as it can get at this point of history. As we all know, this rather a protracted war between Russia and Ukraine is over there for about 10 months. To be very precise, this invasion started on February 24, 2022, if I talk about the latest invasion, and that makes it more than 290 days, if I count that from today. And since then, we can very easily say that both the countries have at least lost 100,000 very precious lives on each side, including those who were wounded and those who took to death. So this is proving to be a very costly war, not only in terms of human casualty, but also there is a massive refugee crisis that is emerging. And if I can go by the number, I'm sure Professor Motyl will correct me later. The number perhaps has reached to about 8 million. That many, or maybe a little more, immigration or refugees have crossed the border. That makes it one of the worst refugee crises since the Second World War II. And if we talk about the economic damages, then I think hardly there is a country that hasn't taken a blow, either directly or indirectly, or had suffered majorly because of this protracted Russia-Ukraine war. And we are going to take a very fresh toll on this particular war. And also we'll try to dig out how exactly this started, what has been the motivation for Russia, especially of that Mr. Putin, to keep this war going for so long, why the international community is not successful in stopping this war, and also a couple of other burning questions, including is this war going to end at all? And if yes, then when is going to be that? So these are extremely critical, burning, hot button issues that the whole world want to find answers of. And to find the answers, we are extremely privileged to have Professor Alexander J. Motyl with us. I'm so delighted in introducing him today. His short bio looks extremely impressive to me. Let me read it for you. Dr. Alexander Motyl is a scholar and an artist. By day, he is a professor of political science at Rutgers, New York, a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the USSR, and on nationalism, revolutions, empires, and theory. He is the author of 10 books of notification, including Imperial Ends, The Decay, Collapse, and Revival of Empires, that was published in 2001. Revolutions, Nations, Empires, Conceptual Limits and Theoretical Possibilities, 1999. Dilemmas of Independence, Ukraine and Totalitarianism, in 1993. And The Turn to the Right, The Ideological Origins and Development of Ukrainian Nationalism, 1999 to 1929, 1980. The editor of 15 volumes, including the Encyclopedia of Nationalism, 2000, and the Holodomor Reader, 2012, and a contributor of dozens of articles to academic and policy journals, newspaper op-ed pages, and magazines. He also has a weekly blog, Ukraine's Orange Blue. So that was what he does in the daytime. And by night, Motyl is a novelist, poet, and a painter. His novels include The Taste of Snow, Serevana Bava Press, 2013. You would like to excuse my pronunciation, Professor? Mr. My Orchidea, Brick House Books, 2012. The Jew Who Was Ukrainian, Serevad Barva, 2011. Who Killed Andrei Warhol, Seven Locks Press, 2007. Flippancy, Kantara Books, 2007. And Whiskey Priest, Universe, 2005. His poems have appeared in Counterexample Poetics, Istanbul Literary Review, and New York Quarterly, and he has performed his fiction at the Cornelia Street Cafe, the Bowery Poetry Club, and the Ukrainian Museum in New York. Shown in solo and group shows in New York, Philadelphia, and Toronto. Motyl's artwork is represented by the internet gallery, that is www.artisele.com. A native New Yorker, Motyl received his doctoral degree in political science, Master of Philosophy in Political Science, and Master of International Affairs from Columbia University. As you can see by this bio itself, we can expect an extremely important and critical discussion at this very important juncture of the history where this war between Russia and Ukraine is still going on. I will be having about close to an hour for this session, and I would like to request Professor Motyl to have his deliberation finished in about close to 30 to 35 minutes, and rest I have separated for Q&A. I already have got a few questions, and you are free to send us the questions if you have any. And without any delay, I would now like to request Professor Alexander J. Motyl for his presentation, and afterwards we'll be having questions for him. Over to you, Professor Motyl.
Thank you, Dr. Nishant, for that extremely generous introduction. Undeservedly generous, but in any case, thank you so much anyway. It's a real honor and it's a real privilege to be able to address such a distinguished group of scholars, academics, analysts, and of course, experts. So I'll try, as instructed, I will speak for about 30, 35 minutes, and then of course I'd welcome whatever critical or non-critical comments or questions that you might have. I hope we have a nice discussion, conversation, and perhaps even a debate. Let me go straight into the matter. And as you know, the title talked about the war and causes and consequences. So let me talk about the causes, then I'll talk about the actual war, and then about the consequences. So roughly 10 minutes apiece, perhaps. And Dr. Nishant, if you see that I'm beginning to go over, if I'm approaching my time limit, please send me a signal of some kind. By all means, interrupt me, because I have a tendency, like all professors, to talk too much. Anyways,
no worries.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very, very much. There are essentially two ways in which people interpret, or experts interpret, the beginning of the war, the causes of the war. One is largely external, focused on the behavior of the United States, Western Europe, and NATO. The other is internal, focused on the characteristics and the policies and ideologies of the Russian Federation in general, and more specifically of the Putin regime. Just so that you know, I happen to be a believer in the second approach, the one that focuses on domestic characteristics. I'm fully aware of the international context. I'm just not persuaded that it's relevant. So let me give you the arguments against and then the arguments for. And as I said before, if you disagree, I'd be more than happy to engage in a lengthier conversation. The fundamental argument is of the first side, of the side that focuses on the international component or the international causes of the war, essentially focuses on the West's insistence that NATO make decisions on its own, that is to say, North Atlantic Treaty Organization has a sovereign right to invite whomever it wants to and accept whoever it wants to. And related to this is the notion, again, that NATO is a threat to Russian security. NATO enlargement is a threat to Russian security. And of course, the possibility that Ukraine would have joined NATO would have been a threat to Russian security as well. Personally, I've never found any of those arguments to be very persuasive, and let me just give you answers as to the reasons why. If you look at the condition of the armies that comprise NATO, and remember, as of course, as all of you know, there is no such thing as a NATO army. Each individual member state has its own army. Well, for the last 30 years, other than the United Kingdom, Poland, and of course the United States, the armies of all of the individual NATO states have been sorely neglected. The expenditures, which were supposed to be roughly 0.5% of GDP, are significantly below that. There was an assumption on the part of most European members of NATO that war was unthinkable. Attempts to revive NATO by including it in operations in Afghanistan were not successful. These were attempts primarily initiated by the United States, as you know. In effect, NATO was an institution which lacked any kind of serious military heft. It was fundamentally incapable of acting in a coordinated manner due to the fact that its members also had very different interpretations and understandings of security in general, their own security in particular. Their armies were outdated, underfunded, demoralized, and pretty much irrelevant. The Soviets knew this. In the Soviets, again, this wasn't the case in the late 1980s. As far as the Soviets were concerned, NATO did represent something in the nature of a threat, and it's understandable that they felt that way. But when Putin comes to power in 1999, progressively he transforms NATO into this boogeyman, this embodiment of evil, a threat to Russia. And as I suggested to you just now, there is simply no way that any kind of objective analysis of NATO could have led to the conclusion that it was a threat to Russia, a security threat to Russia. One can understand that the Russians were peeved, they might have been angry, they might have been annoyed, but if they were rational human beings, they would have seen, as of course their intelligence services that have penetrated both NATO and the European Union would have told them, in any case, the Russians would have seen that there is simply no threat here. The United States might have been a threat. That's true, but that's not NATO. So NATO, to my mind, it really couldn't have been about NATO. Unless, of course, one assumes that the Russians are paranoid and live in some kind of parallel universe, and the mere existence of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, regardless of its capacity to fight, to initiate conflict, to defend itself, is irrelevant. So in other words, if one assumes that the Russians are paranoid and perhaps slightly incapable of understanding the true reality, then one can appreciate that they might have indeed seen this as a threat. But then we're talking about a country and a leadership that is simply incapable of understanding what the reality is, which doesn't exactly help the Russian case, and it certainly doesn't help the case of NATO having been perceived as a threat. So I would argue that NATO wasn't much of a threat for perfectly objective reasons, that the Russians had to have known this. And their insistence that Ukraine's becoming a member of NATO would have simply incorporated and increased the threat level posed by NATO is simply unpersuasive. It's unpersuasive for a number of reasons. One is the fact that since the war began, two countries have in fact joined NATO, Sweden and Finland. And even though the Russians insisted that any form of expansion of NATO would be regarded as a threat, remember they were saying this in December of last year and January of this year, the fact that two countries have joined NATO, one of which Finland, has a very, very long border with Russia, none of this has ruffled Russian feathers. So it's not about expansion, nor is it about NATO, it's not about NATO expansion, nor is it about membership in NATO. It's fundamentally about Ukraine. At the same time, everybody knew, the Russians knew, the Ukrainians knew, the Americans, the Europeans, everyone knew and said this quite openly, that Ukraine's chances of joining NATO were virtually nil for the next 20 years. It was unprepared, it was unready, it was unable, and so on. So everybody pretty much understood that this was not going to happen. That being the case, the notion that Ukraine was imminently going to join NATO, and the notion that the United States would then deploy nuclear weapons on Ukraine's eastern border and thereby threaten Russia, was simply preposterous. Again, there was just no basis whatsoever in the reality and in the logic of events. And notice, by the way, in as much as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and now Finland, of course, as well as Romania and Bulgaria are members of NATO, if the United States intended to threaten Russia, it could easily do so by deploying nuclear weapons in Estonia. Now, significantly closer to St. Petersburg and Moscow than Ukraine is. But that doesn't trouble the Russians. So it's not about NATO. It's not about NATO expansion, nor is it about Ukraine's membership in NATO. What then is the real reason? And the real reason, as I would argue, is relatively straightforward. We have to keep in mind that the Soviet Union was an empire, and this empire collapsed. We know from history that all empires end sooner or later, but we also know from history that most of them tend to decay over time as a result of internal contradictions, national liberation struggles, and the like. And over time can be over decades, it can be over centuries, as with the case of the Ottoman Empire. As with the British Empire, that was a question more of decades. And of course, you know this far better than I do. In some instances, and there are only very few, empires that are pretty much self-sustaining and exist at a certain level of stability, they collapse within a few weeks, within a few months, and sometimes within a few years. So I'd like to distinguish between imperial decay, which is the norm for empires, and imperial collapse, which is the exception to the norm. What happens when imperial decay occurs, imperial metropoles, by and large, again, this isn't an ironclad rule, by and large get used to the loss of an empire. And even though they continue to meddle in the affairs of the former provinces, the former colonies, they generally do not have designs for re-imperialization. They don't want to necessarily, they don't want to revive and rebuild the empire that has progressively decayed and disappeared. In contrast, when empires collapse, usually as a result of some kind of significant trigger, some kind of spark, that can be a war, that can be an internal crisis, there is in fact a desire, as was manifest in the case of the Bolsheviks, the Nazis, with regard to Russia and Germany, and of course with regard to post-Soviet Russia, right? Because we keep in mind that the Soviet Union collapsed within a few years. It was a vibrant state in 1986, 1987, and by 1991, it ceased to exist. Under these sorts of circumstances, post-imperial elites have a variety of discursive, ideological, economic, as well as military and political reasons to maintain and revive the connections that were so crudely and brutally disrupted as a result of collapse. And what we see in the aftermath of collapse is attempts, sometimes successful, sometimes unsuccessful, on the part of imperial elites to revive imperial rule. And I would submit to you that this is precisely what we see under Putin since his coming to power in 1999. It's been an attempt to revive the empire in bits and pieces. So there was the Georgian War of 2008. There was the continued occupation of Transnistria since the early 1990s. Attempts to exert hegemony over Central Asia and Armenia. And then, of course, the jewel in the crown, as it were, the war that was begun in 2014 in the Crimea and the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, and then continued in February 24th with a full-scale assault and invasion of Ukraine. In addition to these imperial motivations, we need to keep in mind two additional factors that played a role in the decision to go to war against Ukraine. One is political cultural. There is a long-standing ideological, discursive, and cultural tradition within Russia, going back for at least 400 or 500 years, of denying the existence of Ukrainians and treating them as a kind of inferior race. This was very manifestly the case in the 18th and 19th century in Imperial Russia. It was moderated to a certain degree and acquired a specific kind of characteristic in the Soviet Union, where the Ukrainians were perceived as the younger brothers, the Bumpkins, the country bumpkins of the sophisticated Russian elder brother. And this has become part and parcel of the Putinite ideology since at least 1999. So we have that kind of background condition. I'm not suggesting that it led to the war, but it facilitated the war. It facilitated thinking of Ukrainians as inherently inferior, as inherently hostile to whatever the Russians might be or might want to do. And then the last factor that is of critical importance is the fact that Putin has constructed, starting in 1999 and proceeding with virtually unceasing energy, he's constructed some call it an authoritarian state, some call it totalitarian. I prefer to call it fascist, but whatever you call it, it's obviously a deeply anti-democratic, profoundly authoritarian, and possibly fascist state, within which you have an extreme centralization of power, a rooting ideology that promises to make Russia great again, and of course a supreme leader, namely Putin, with a cult of the personality, and it's a cult of personality that focuses on his hyper-masculinity, his vigor, his youth, and of course the implication, as well as the open statement on the part of Russian propagandists, is that just as Putin is young, vigorous, and strong, so too Russia will become young, vigorous, and strong. And just as Putin will revive a strong Russia, so too Russia will revive the empire that it lost in 1991. So you take all these three factors, the imperial collapse, an authoritarian and possibly fascist regime, and a political culture that essentially denies Ukrainians personhood, humanity, and any kind of remote equality with the Russians. You add these things together, and in fact, something like a war would have been pretty much overdetermined. I don't want to suggest, excuse me, I don't want to suggest that it was inevitable, but it was pretty much overdetermined. As to the timing of the war, that's a question that people are still discussing. It was as you may know, the New York Times recently published a lengthy analysis suggesting that the decision was made exclusively by Putin. Others have suggested that mobilizing such a large force for whatever end required at least a year, in which case it may be the case that the decision to go to war was adopted sometime in early 2021. Just today, I read an analysis, an interview with a Ukrainian general saying that it wasn't just Putin, it was in fact the FSB, the intelligence service of the Russian Federation, that was promoting the war first and foremost. We can talk about the issue of timing later on. I think at this point, the discussions that concerned Russian security had something to do with the timing. But fundamentally, I suspect it had everything to do with Putin's decision that he simply needed to end the so-called Ukrainian threat to Russia's existence. A few words about the so-called Ukrainian threat. It's been ballyhooed in recent months that now Russia is fighting a war of survival. Well, it's fighting a war of survival because it happens to be losing the war that it initiated. But again, the very notion that Ukraine today, that is to say half a year ago or a year ago, posed anything resembling a threat to Russia, again, strikes me as preposterous. Then Russia had a huge army, it was considered to be very strong, has thousands of nuclear weapons, has a population of 145 million, has a territory that spans 11 time zones, and one can go on. And of course, it has enormous energy resources. And on all of those counts, Ukraine comes short. So in terms of hard power, in terms of soft power, there's simply no way in which one can argue that Ukraine posed anything resembling a threat to Russia in NATO or outside of NATO. That simply would not have been the case. In any case, where are we now? The war began, as has been said, on February 24th. The expectation on the part of virtually everybody was that the war would end within a few days, possibly within a few weeks. And then almost miraculously, the Ukrainians held off the Russian invasion. And within a week or two, it was pretty clear that this was no longer going to be an easy undertaking, a simple military operation, that it was going to transform itself into a war, and possibly a long-standing war. As you know from your own studies, I'm sure I won't recapitulate the actual details, but Russia occupied a fair amount of territory, over 20%, within a few weeks of its invasion. Several provinces in the north, Kiev, Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, and Luhansk, and then several provinces in the south, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Donetsk. And it looked in mid-April as if the Russians were going to be on the advance and possibly continue to capture more territory. But it's precisely at that time that the Ukrainians put up a stiff resistance. They also began acquiring weapons from the West, from the Europeans, from the United States and other countries. And not only were they able to put up a stiff resistance, but the Russians were forced to withdraw from the provinces in the north. Then after a fairly difficult summer, during which neither side was able to make particular headway, there was a breakthrough in Kharkiv province, and the Ukrainians recaptured most of it, at this point all of it. And then, as you know, about a month and a half ago, they were able to push out the Russians from Kherson in the south, so that now the amount of territory that the Russians control is significantly smaller. It's about half as much as what they had at the beginning of the war. Ukrainian calculations as to how many soldiers, Russian soldiers, have been killed in the war are about 98,000. Some other sources suggest that it's 100,000 wounded and killed. I'm inclined to believe the Ukrainian estimate for a very simple reason, because we know for two reasons. One is that a number of indirect estimates made on the part of Russian officialdom in the course of the last few weeks have been remarkably close to the Ukrainian estimate. I'll just give you one example. Back in April, end of April, when the Ukrainians were estimating that the number of Russian fatalities was about 35,000, the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs openly said that they had received 40 to 45,000 letters of inquiry from relatives of missing soldiers, missing in action soldiers, who in all likelihood would have been killed. That leads me to think that Ukrainian estimates are actually on the mark. And even if 98,000 is a little too high, it might be 75, 80, 85, but that seems to be the area within which the numbers are most accurate. Ukrainian sources say that their losses are anywhere between 1/3 and 1/8 of Russian losses. If it's 1/3, it would be 30,000. If it's 1/8, it would be 10,000. 10,000 strikes me as being far too optimistic. I'm inclined to think it's more like 1/3. But again, in total, Ukrainian losses killed and wounded are probably about 100,000. Russian losses killed are probably closer to 100,000, and then another 100,000 or 200,000 wounded. And the other reason for thinking these numbers are accurate is the fact that Russia has had an enormous manpower problem within the last 2 months. It started, as you know, it's now recruiting, it's recruited something like 20 to 30,000 criminals who've been taken out of jails. It's adopted a general mobilization and recruited some 150,000 soldiers who are now serving in various capacities on the front lines, and another 150,000 who are being trained. This suggests to me, and of course the fact that the Russians admit this openly, that they are having serious manpower problems. In any case, remarkably enough, the Ukrainians have put up an enormous resistance. Not only that, they've proven themselves to be superior in their tactics as well as in their strategies. Again, we could talk about this later, but the performance of the Russian army has been astoundingly poor. Their logistics has been lousy. Their planning has been bad. Their command and control has been bad. They sent their soldiers into battle without preparation, without food, without clothing. It just goes to show that the much ballyhooed military reform that Putin adopted in 2008, during which billions of dollars were spent ostensibly on reforming the Russian military, it seems clear now that the vast majority of those funds were simply purloined by perhaps Putin, but in any case, certainly by his minions. So we have on the one hand, excellent performance thus far on the part of the Ukrainians, a remarkably poor performance on the part of the Russians. And of course, the ability of the Ukrainians to advance and recapture their territories are, as I obviously partly due to their own resilience, their own resistance, and their own capacities. But it would have been impossible without the fact that Ukraine has received significant financial assistance from the West, as well as very significant military assistance from the United States, as well as from a slew of countries. And as you know, the number of countries that are currently providing some form of assistance to Ukraine is over 60. These are the countries that are involved in the so-called Ramstein Process. Which is an important, a significant number, as you can well imagine. Let me now, I see I only have about 5 to 10 minutes, so I will end my discussion of the war at this point. At this point, just to add the following, at this point, unless something miraculous happens, it looks very likely that the Ukrainians will be able to liberate those territories that Russia seized after February 24th. Will they be able to liberate the occupied Donbass and Crimea is an open question. That will depend on a variety of factors that we may want to discuss later on. But at this point, it looks likely, not certain, but certainly likely, that the Ukrainians will be able to keep up their advances. Now, what are the consequences of this? Let me start first with Ukraine. If Ukraine wins, and I think at this point the chances of Ukraine's winning the war are significantly better than the chances of its losing the war. And in a matter of speaking, the Ukraine has already won the war. The mere fact that it has been able to resist a superpower and resist it more than just passively, but actively, and actually push it back is already an enormous victory for the Ukrainian armed forces. Of course, the price that they've paid is enormous, both in terms of military and civilian lives, as well as in terms of economic and infrastructure destruction. But be that as it may, one can argue that the Ukrainians have already won. If the Ukrainians win, however, in the sense that they are able to push back the Russians from most, if not indeed all, of the territories that Russia has occupied since 2014. If the Ukrainians succeed in doing this, then they will have accomplished several very important achievements. In the matter of speaking, they already have accomplished some of these, but I'll just mention them all together. One is that there has occurred and is still occurring and will continue to occur a remarkable consolidation of the Ukrainian nation. There was, as you know, discussion of various fissures and fragmentations within Ukrainian national identity. Putin has essentially resolved those. He has transformed 95%, if not more, of the Ukrainian population into ardent patriots who now see themselves as being committed to Ukrainian sovereignty, Ukrainian territoriality, Ukrainian nationhood and statehood. Secondly, Ukraine will emerge from the war with a far more competent and stronger state than it had. The executive will be stronger, the police will be stronger, the army will be stronger. All these are factors that are, of course, important, both in terms of its capacity to root out corruption internally and its capacity to resist aggression from the outside. So in a manner of speaking, the war will promote Ukrainian nation building and Ukrainian state building. Final point, I think Ukraine will emerge from the war as a major player within Eurasian politics, geopolitics. For a number of years, it will be economically impoverished, but the fact of having defeated a significant power such as Russia, even holding it at bay will give Ukraine an important place in discussions regarding the security arrangements within Eurasia. I wouldn't be surprised that after the war ends, Ukraine becomes a NATO member. And again, Russia will have no one to thank for that or blame for that except itself. And I wouldn't be surprised if within a few years, Ukraine also becomes a member of the European Union. As to Russia, the consequences for Russia can be several-fold. One is, as we already know from a variety of sources, Putin's position has become significantly weaker. He was a supreme leader as of a number of years ago, as of a year ago. Now his leadership has been questioned but certainly by the Democrats or the quasi-Democrats, and now by the resurgent right. He still retains a fair amount of popularity, but even that's declined. So Putin's legitimacy, his ability to deliver, his ability to make Russia great has obviously been shaken. People have been suggesting that he might be overthrown or forced into retirement. I personally think that's a very plausible scenario. It could happen within the next few weeks. It could happen within the next few months. If it does, or perhaps I should say when it does, then the Putin regime, this hyper-authoritarian, hyper-centralized regime that was centered on him and his personality cult, will be hard-pressed to survive. If you have a regime that is so dependent on a single individual who formed the regime, who was its core for over 20 years, his departure will then weaken that regime and perhaps make it incapable of surviving. In any case, if and when a Russian loss occurs, that is likely to be the time when Putin's departure occurs as well. Of course, it's also possible that Putin will depart before the loss actually takes place. But in all likelihood, these things will be more or less simultaneous. And given the fact that Putin's departure is likely to take place, given the fact that he's such an important part of the regime he created, the regime is unlikely to survive. In any case, even if it continues to creak along, it's likely to be severely, severely weakened. With a weakened regime, with the weakened authoritarian regime, with the defeat suffered at the hands of inferior combatant, namely Ukraine, it is perfectly possible for the Russian Federation to descend into civil war, and perhaps even into war. And here I think the analogy with the Soviet Union is appropriate. The Soviet Union fell apart, not because of a war, although there was the war in Afghanistan, but because Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika essentially destroyed the system from within. Putin's war, which I think will go down in history as a strategic miscalculation of historical proportions, could have the same effect, and indeed is already having the same effect. It's creating enormous economic chaos. It's creating and weakening, it's weakening the political system. It's already weakened enormously the state and the military. And within such a broad systemic crisis, it's perfectly plausible and indeed highly likely that a number of non-Russian subject nationalities within the Russian Federation will, like the non-Russian republics and the Russian republics in late 1980s and early 1990s, that these non-Russian nationalities will begin to attempt to preserve themselves from the chaos surrounding them. And the most effective way of doing that would be to opt for greater autonomy, perhaps indeed for greater independence, for independence. So it's perfectly possible that we may be seeing the beginning of the end of the Russian Federation. Now, by the way, I'll end on this point, but just make one more comment. This view that the Russian Federation is in serious trouble and could actually collapse, not decay, but actually collapse within months or within years, is one that obviously I endorse. as you've noticed from my presentation. But more importantly, it's one that a variety of Russians support as well. And it's not just Putin's opponents on the democratic side who believe that the Russian Federation's collapse is possible and perhaps even imminent. It's in fact moderate Russians as well as hardline right-wing Russians who argue this position. So there seems to be a growing consensus on the part of the expert community in Russia, in the West, perhaps in Asia as well, and certainly in Ukraine, that what Putin has done is in fact precipitated the possible collapse of the Russian Federation and the transformation of Ukraine from a weak, more or less corrupt, and uncertainly identified nation and state into a state that will now align itself solidly with democracy, liberalism, and the kinds of values that Democrats and liberals throughout the world share. Ironically, then, Putin may turn out to be the destroyer of Russia, and in fact, one of Ukraine's state builders and nation builders. Of course, he didn't intend any of this, which just goes to show that elites oftentimes achieve the exact opposite of what they hope to attain with their actions. I thank you for your attention, esteemed audience, and as I said before, be more than delighted to hear your critical comments, your questions, and your comments in general. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Motyl. That was extremely enlightening, and also you helped us understand where exactly this Russia-Ukraine war stands at this moment of history and how the things may unfold in the future. And the question about when this war is going to end, as you have already said, that's $1 million question, and the answer I think we need to keep finding. I have already got several questions from the audience, and I also suggest the audience, if they have a question, please do send that to me in the chat box, and I'll be more than happy to share that with the professor. And in the meantime, before I take any questions from anyone else, I have a couple of queries, though you have answered me partly, but still. Professor, how real is the threat of this nuclear war or Russia going nuclear? Because Putin has been found on several occasions, at times being very indirect, but at times also threatening directly. Do you think that is just a ploy made by Putin to keep the Western countries at bay, or you see that that can be a real threat? There's a tangible threat, and there is a possibility of that happening too. And the second part of the same question is there any possible military option taken either by the USA, EU, or both of them together? So there are these two intertwined questions, and if you'd like to answer them.
Yes, thank you. So let me start with the second question. So the military options for the United States or for the Europeans vis-a-vis Russia or Ukraine? Or both?
I mean, if at all there is a military option taken by the USA, that of course has to be against the Russian Federation. So do you think that they will go for any military option?
No, I think the answer to that is no. I mean, the United States desperately wants not to get involved in any kind of frontal military altercation with Russia, and the Europeans, even more so. So I would exclude that. That doesn't mean that it couldn't happen, but it would have to happen as a result of some kind of miscalculation, or perhaps as a result of an accident of some sort. That's a possibility, but I am 99% certain that no country in the West wants to start any kind of military engagement with the Russians, which is why the West has been so hesitant providing certain kinds of weapons to Ukraine, because there's a fear that some kind of escalation might occur, and then that would draw the United States or the Europeans into the conflict. And of course, they already are in the conflict, but it would actively involve them as active participants and not just onlookers and suppliers of weapons. As to your first question, my answer is I just don't know. And as you know, as everybody, as you know, and as the audience knows as well, there are arguments for both sides. My own view is this, but if, again, keep in mind that I'm adamantly ignorant on, not ignorant, but adamantly unsure of what the answer to this is. For Putin to engage in this, he would be defying the wishes not only of the United States, the Ukrainians and the Europeans, but also of the Central Asians, of India, of China, of a very large number of countries, some of whom are actually considered to be his allies or his friends. So he would be going perhaps not against the wishes of the entire international community, but against a significant portion of the international community. It's been spelled out to Putin on a number of occasions, especially by the United States, that there would be extremely serious consequences. By that, people don't mean a response, a nuclear response, but a massive conventional response. It's also been pointed out to Putin, and a number of other individuals have argued this, that if nuclear weapons were to be used in Ukraine, first of all, given the direction of winds, a significant portion of the radioactive fallout would go to Russia, or would go to territories occupied by Russia. It's also been pointed out that even if they use these weapons against the Ukrainian military, the fact that the Ukrainian military is largely decentralized and dispersed would mean that they would have very minimal military consequences for the war. So it's been pointed out that this would be useless at best, dangerous and risky at worst. And to put it somewhat colloquially, Putin would have to be irrational to embark on this kind of mad scheme. And I find this persuasive. My problem with this line of reasoning, and as you can see, this is my own line of reasoning, is that it was irrational for Putin to have embarked on the war. Everybody pretty much told Putin before the war that if you embark on the war, you will engage, the Ukrainians will fight. It won't be easy. It's not going to be 2 days. It might be years. There will be massive casualties on both sides. There will be serious sanctions. There will be, and so on and so forth. There would be all sorts of consequences for you, for Putin, not just for the Ukrainians, but for you. And most of those consequences would be deleterious consequences. So why would you do this? You would have to be irrational. Well, as you know, Putin did it. Which is why I have this very large question mark over the analysis I began with. It does not make any rational sense for Putin to do this. But it's not clear to me that Putin is fully rational. And at that point, the discussion ends. And I just don't know what to say anymore, other than that we need to be careful. And we need to be hopeful that inasmuch as the decision to adopt that kind, to implement nuclear weapons is fortunately not only Putin's. As you know, Putin makes the initial decision, but then I believe it's 5 or 6 generals on the general staff who have to support that decision sequentially. I think that's very important. And that gives me some hope, because the army has been battered, whether it's 98,000 dead or 98,000 dead and wounded, it doesn't matter. The army has been battered. And it would seem reasonable to think that there must be at least one Russian general who doesn't want to destroy the army, who doesn't want to destroy possibly himself and his country as well in the process. So that leaves me hope, but it has nothing to do with Putin or the circumstances. It's fundamentally focused on the hope that there is at least one rational Russian general on the general staff.
Thank you for that. I have several questions. How do you prefer? Do you want to have the questions in a cluster, maybe in a group of 2 or 3?
Yes, perhaps that would be better. Yes,
Yeah,
3
okay.
perhaps.
Yeah. So here is this set of questions from Khyati Anand. She's asking why the international society has not been able to bring this war to an end through diplomatic process or arbitration despite of international organizations in place. And the second part of the question is, does this war have something to do with keeping the international society engaged and face consequences while the large power gain more dominance over the weaker ones? And if I have to add one more question to this one, does this war puts forward a need for countries to provide a part of their sovereignty to an international organization where the decisions will be taken in interest of the humanity and not just a particular state in particular for a particular region? So I think these are 3 questions that are by and large interrelated. Would you like to take them?
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, all of them, of course, focus on the ability of the international community to regulate, prevent, and deal with conflict. And of course, as you know, the international community is hampered for a variety of reasons. One is, if by international community we mean 197 sovereign states, then of course it would be very difficult to get them to agree on anything. Primarily what we mean, I think, is the United Nations. And as you know, the General Assembly can adopt a variety of very important resolutions that set the moral bounds for the actions, but translating that into effective policy is where it gets very complicated, because at that point, the Security Council has to agree. And given that Russia is a member of the Security Council, it's always capable of exerting a veto, regardless of what the issue happens to be. So that hamstrings, that prevents the international community from acting decisively. And of course, as you know, I mean, the United States also has its interests and is not always amenable to acting in accordance with the international community. So the great powers tend to get in the way. But that aside, why hasn't diplomacy worked in ending this particular conflict? I think it's a broader question, whether it's international, national, or in whichever level it happens to be taking place. The fundamental problem with the diplomatic solution is that the Russians have a very maximalist position. Essentially, their argument is that the Ukrainian state has either to be destroyed or become completely or a colonial province of the Russian Federation. They actually do talk about the destruction of the state. They talk about having friend relations with Russia, but everybody knows that means being completely subordinate to the Russian Federation's wishes. The Russian Federation under Putin has also adopted a policy of openly admitted, and I emphasize this, openly admitted genocide vis-a-vis the Ukrainian people. Putin has essentially endorsed this policy and so on. And a variety of Russian propagandists and analysts have explicitly stated that the Ukrainian nation has to be destroyed. And of course, we see the consequences on the battlefield. Given those sorts of positions, it's not clear what there's to talk about. All right. It would be like Jews negotiating with Nazi Germany. I mean, what exactly are you supposed to be talking about? The conditions, how many meals you get before they gas you in Auschwitz. I mean, that doesn't seem like an appropriate discussion. And then, of course, what makes the problem also complicated is Putin's decision to formally annex the 4 provinces that he occupied. Russia has no constitutional procedure for letting go territories. It has constitutional procedures for acquiring territories. This means that technically it cannot discuss any kind of territorial solution or territorial compromise. So given the fact that you have an international community that is relatively weakened by the Russian presence on the Security Council, and given the maximalist demands made by the Russian Federation, I'm not surprised that diplomatic solutions have thus far been virtually impossible. And I don't see them changing anytime soon unless Russia suffers a defeat. If it suffers a defeat, and we can debate what that means, but if it suffers something like a defeat, then it would be amenable to some kind of diplomatic solution of whatever remains of the conflict. There was a discussion of stronger versus the weaker. And I think, this is an instance where certainly the international community or regional alliances of various kinds can certainly make a difference. In this particular case, as I mentioned before, it's clear that by far the stronger power is Russia. By any measure, Ukraine is weaker, although it's becoming stronger as a result of the war. Nevertheless, it's certainly weaker, and that imbalance will likely persist into the future. So one of the primary concerns of the Ukrainians now, even more so than before, is precisely the issue that Russia talks about, namely security guarantees. It's not clear to me why Russia, a great power, needs security guarantees. Against whom? But it's clear to the Ukrainians that they need security guarantees against Russia. After all, they've been invaded twice, in 2014 and in 2022. So ideally, the United Nations would have the capacity to protect the weaker countries from the stronger ones, the victims from the aggressors. And that, of course, relates not just to Russia, but it also relates to behavior on the part of other great powers, such as the United States. I fully recognize that this country has engaged in excessive involvements abroad, to put it in somewhat euphemistically. But I can imagine that, not just imagine, the Ukrainians are insistent that they become members of NATO. Whether NATO can protect them is another issue, but the point is they want some kind of security guarantees. And of course, membership in NATO at least purports to provide a security guarantee. And then I believe the final question dealt with similar issues. But the problem here is how do we strengthen the international community? How do we transform it into something that is more equitable, but at the same time more effective in making decisions? And equity demands, for instance, that the Security Council be expanded. It makes no sense for some of the countries on the Security Council to be on the Security Council, and for countries like India, Brazil, Nigeria not to be on the Security Council. It doesn't make any sense. But of course, as you all know from your studies, if you expand the Security Council to 10, 15, or 20, and retain the veto, that'll simply make the Security Council even more incapable of acting.
Yeah.
Because it'll be, unless of course there's majority vote.
True.
Pardon?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you. So on the one hand, equity demands that the council be expanded. That would make it more representative, but efficiency would probably be greater if it were smaller, but that's impossible and of course undesirable in today's world. How do you reconcile these two factors is of course the issue. I don't know. One needs to maintain both, of course.
I have a couple of more questions. So I think looking at the time factor, if you can entertain them maybe in quick succession, that will be very helpful. Here is a question that may test your memory. It has come from Javadat ul Hassan, and he's asking, excuse me, in the Yalta Conference of 1945, if you know it, it was put forth that Russia should be given the power of influence on East. Does that have an impact on the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, it does in the sense that Russia believes that it has a sphere of influence, that it was deprived unjustly of this sphere of influence. I referred to empire. If you prefer, if empire is too strong a term, one can just talk about sphere of influence. So yes, but that notion predates the Yalta Conference, because remember, the Imperial Russian state had a sphere of influence in Eastern and Central Europe, as did the Soviet Union. And so in that sense, there's a variety of factors that come together in creating this notion that Russia has a right to a sphere of influence in its so-called backyard.
Okay. Next is a question from Simran Guljar. It's a rather speculative question, and I think you have answered it in part. Do you think Ukraine will stand by USA if Putin will be withdrawn or overthrown, or they will remain independent from USA?
Well, if by standby you mean will there continue to be an alliance of sorts, or
in alliance, or yes, or
something like the relationship at present?
Exactly.
I think yes. I think yes. Well, of course, it partly depends on who's president and in which party runs the Congress. But that said, I think the United States has made a strategic choice, as well as the Europeans. They made a strategic choice to regard Ukraine as an ally. Now, does that mean they will intervene on behalf of Ukraine? Probably not. But does that mean that they will regard them as a strategic ally in that part of the world? I think that choice has been made. So I think, regardless of what happens in Russia, whether Putin stays or goes, whether Russia wins or loses, the Ukraine will remain an important strategic partner of the West. And that wasn't the case in the past. For 30 years, Ukraine was always on the margins, on the periphery. Now, I think it's become not the core concern, but close to the core concern.
Mm-hmm. Now I have one question, and that has some personal interest, because a couple of my close family relatives do live in Europe. As it was said earlier, that Europe, in particular West Germany, might have a very difficult winter, looking at their relationship with Russia in terms of gas supply and others. How difficult this winter is going to be in Germany? Or
well,
all of Europe?
Well, the Europeans in general, and the Germans in particular, they filled up their gas reserves almost to 100%. So they're well equipped with gas. They have alternative sources for buying gas as well, LNG from the United States and other places. They still have access to oil. Prices, of course, have risen, but it's not as if at this point in time or in the immediate future, they'll be suffering from shortages that will lead to cold winters, and to exceptionally cold winters. So my sense is, based on what I've been reading, is that the Europeans will be able to manage quite well with the forthcoming winter. There will be grumbling because there will be some problems in some areas, but I don't think it'll be so strong as to affect policy choices, certainly not within the next 2-3 months.
Okay, maybe the last set of questions, it has come from Alok Shivam, and he's asking, first, can this Russia-Ukraine war be seen as an example of the persistent presence of the realist school in the global discourse? And the second part of the question is, I don't know how far you'd like to answer this one. What has this war's impact on the India-Ukraine bilateral relationship? Maybe he's referring to the fact that India is buying petrol from Russia. So these are the two questions from Alok Shivam.
Well, as to the first question, the war can be interpreted in a variety of ways, and as you know, there have been all sorts of academics and analysts who argue in the neo-realist mode, and argue that yes, indeed, Ukraine was a threat of sorts to Russia. It was a core interest. NATO's expansion was a threat. And as I've argued, several minutes ago, I don't see that. Ukraine wasn't a threat. NATO wasn't a threat. Maybe the United States was some kind of objective threat, but certainly not those institutions and not Ukraine per se. And my argument has been quite the opposite, that it wasn't the objective nature of the threat that Russia felt. It was rather a subjective, a perception on the part of the Russian elite relating to the nature of the imperial collapse, the nature of the regime, and the nature of the Russian discourse, culture, and ideology that transformed Ukraine and NATO, but specifically Ukraine, into a threat. So personally, I think the war is actually better evidence for the critics of neorealism than it is for the neorealists themselves. And if you could just remind me about the second question, please. I'm sorry, I can't hear you, sir.
It was about how it's going to be having an impact on India-Ukraine relationship.
Ah, yes, yes. Well, India's managed to walk a kind of tightrope, hasn't come out openly in support of Ukraine, hasn't come out openly in support of Russia. So it's let's call it a kind of neutrality. I think as for a variety of reasons having to do with India's experience as a colony, India's experience as a victim of, well, Western aggression, India's commitment to democracy. I think objectively, India should be or is on the side of Ukraine. And I think the Ukrainians appreciate that fact. But at the same time, of course, India has its particular interests, and one of those is inexpensive energy resources. And since the Russians are selling, the Indians are buying, and that, again, I fully understand that. That makes perfect sense. I don't see the relationship or the relations being harmed significantly, if at all. If India were supplying Russia with weapons, then the Ukrainians would obviously have an axe to grind. If India were openly supportive of the aggression, then of course the Ukrainians would feel that way too. But the Ukrainians are sufficiently realistic to understand that as much as they want countries to support them actively, they're also happy when they're simply neutral, whether formally neutral or just kind of objectively neutral.
Wonderful. I also had a couple of questions, like from Amit Dogra, but you have answered his questions very explicitly during your presentation. So I think the time doesn't let me move any beyond than this point with Q&A session. But I thank everyone who has asked the questions, and you in particular, Professor Motyl. It has been wonderful listening to you, and it has been enlightening. You have given us so many intricate details, and you have also let us understand the different dynamics of Russia-Ukraine war. But what I like most about this presentation and from your deliberations is, I think the world is perhaps going to see a better and perhaps a more democratic Ukraine as and when the war will come to an end. And as you have indicated, perhaps it may not take too long for this war to come to an end, but the end is there on horizon. Only time is a factor. So on that note of being very hopeful, I thank you one more time, Professor Motyl, for your presence, for your kind deliberation. You have enriched all of us with your knowledge and experiences. And I hope the audience of this platform, which comprises mostly from South Asia, but also we have several others who have joined from the different parts of the world, they also must have been benefited, and they would like to hear from you one more time, or maybe more and more in future. So thanks a lot, Professor Motyl.
I'm delighted, honored, and genuinely privileged to have been able to address this distinguished audience. And I hope that we can maintain our relationship in the future as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir, very much. And thank you, respected and esteemed colleagues.
And now I hand over this platform to Sarojji of NICE.
Professor Alexander J. Motyl, thanks a lot for the interesting discussion. We are really honored by your kind presence today. We really learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience immensely benefited from it. Professor Alexander J. Motyl, I, on behalf of NICE and all our audience, would like to thank you for your kind presence and valuable time. We hope to have you in Kathmandu in future. Jai Nishan, thank you for moderating these sessions. We would also like to thank all our audience for their wonderful questions. Thank you so much. Thank you and namaste.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Where are you, Professor Motyl, at this point of time? Are you in?
I'm in New York City.
Ah, how's the weather there? Must be cold.
Yes, yes. 29 degrees or a little below 0 Celsius.
Okay. Have you traveled to this part of the world? Or if I can ask very particularly, have you been to Nepal?
No, I have not.
No.
The closest I've been was Japan. But I have a close friend, Jenik Radon, who has been very active in Nepalese politics and apparently helped write a draft of the constitution for your country.
What's his name?
Radon. Radon, R-A-D-O-N.
Okay, Radon.
And he's visited your country many times. And,
okay.
Anyway, if you mention him, I'm sure there must be some people who would know him.
Yeah, Jenik Radon.
Yes, exactly.
Was he a part of any organization? Because I was also very actively involved in that constitution drafting process, training the parliamentarians and other things.
He's an independent lawyer affiliated with Columbia University.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I'll have to tell him about you. Perhaps there's a relationship that the two of you had that you may not have been fully aware of.
Maybe we just slipped on the name part.
Exactly.
So you
in any case, sir, yes, please.
Yeah, you have a standby invitation from Nish and also from me. Please do visit Nepal. We'll be more than happy to have you over here. And we'll have a very important audience who would love to listen to you as well. So if at all you can find some time, please do come.
Well, thank you very much. That's very, very kind of you. Thank you.
Yeah. We'll go into
Thank you. Thank you.